History books often present World War I as a simple story, a single assassination, a chain reaction, a global conflict that lasted for years. But the truth is far more complex and far more unsettling, because what you were taught in school is only the surface. Beneath that surface lies a hidden world of secrets, power struggles, and decisions that change the fate of millions, often without them even knowing. To truly understand this war, you have to go back to a time when Europe looked calm, but was anything but peaceful. The early 1900s were filled with tension. Empires dominated the map. Britain controlled vast colonies. France was rebuilding its pride. Germany was rising fast, powerful, and ambitious. Russia stretched across continents, unstable yet dangerous. On the outside, these nations spoke of diplomacy, but behind closed doors, something very different was happening. They were preparing for war. Arms were being built at an unprecedented rate. Military budgets were increasing year after year. Generals were creating detailed war plans, calculating how long it would take to defeat enemies, how many soldiers would die, and how quickly victory could be achieved. And perhaps the most dangerous part of all, they believed the war would be short. This belief shaped everything. Because when leaders think a war will be quick, they become less afraid of starting it. But there was another layer to this growing tension, a system of alliances that connected countries like a web. Germany and Austria-Hungary stood together. France and Russia formed their own pact. Britain, initially distant, slowly became part of this balance of power. These alliances were meant to prevent war. Instead, they guaranteed it. Because if one country was attacked, others were obligated to join. A small conflict could become a massive war within days. And that is exactly what happened. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand shocked Europe. A young assassin pulled the trigger, and history remembers this moment as the beginning of the war. But the reality is far more disturbing. The war didn't start because of the assassination. The war started because powerful nations were ready for it. Austria-Hungary saw an opportunity to assert dominance. Germany gave its full support, encouraging aggressive action. Russia stepped in to defend its interests. France backed Russia. Britain followed to maintain balance. Within weeks, the entire continent was at war. But here's what is rarely discussed. Many leaders knew how dangerous this would be. They understood the risks. They saw the scale of destruction that modern weapons could cause. And yet, they moved forward. Some believed war was necessary to maintain power. Others feared losing influence if they backed down. And some simply miscalculated, thinking they could control the outcome. They were wrong. When the war began, soldiers marched with confidence. Many believed they would be home within months. There was excitement, even pride. But that illusion didn't last long. The reality of war quickly revealed itself, and it was nothing like anyone expected. The Western Front became a deadlock. Two sides facing each other across long lines of trenches, unable to advance, unable to retreat. These trenches became the defining image of the war. But they were more than just defensive positions. They were places of unimaginable suffering. Mud swallowed everything. Rain turned the ground into a swamp. Soldiers lived surrounded by death, disease, and constant fear. Rats fed on the bodies of the fallen. Infections spread rapidly. Sleep was rare. Hope was even rarer. And yet, orders kept coming. Soldiers were told to climb out of the trenches and charge across open land, directly into enemy fire. Machine guns cut them down within seconds. Thousands died in a single day, sometimes for just a few meters of ground. And still, the strategy continued, because the generals believed that persistence would lead to victory. They were stuck in an old way of thinking, unable to adapt to the new reality of modern warfare. This disconnect between leadership and soldiers became one of the war's darkest secrets. Another truth that remained hidden was how information was controlled. Governments did everything they could to maintain public support. They censored images of the battlefield. They controlled newspapers. They spread propaganda that painted the war as heroic and necessary. People at home believed their soldiers were winning. They believed sacrifices were leading to victory. But the truth was very different. The war had become a nightmare with no clear end. New technologies only made things worse. Poison gas drifted silently across trenches, burning lungs and blinding soldiers. Tanks crushed through defenses, creating chaos. Airplanes dropped bombs from above, introducing a new dimension of fear. These weapons were powerful, but they were also unpredictable. Even the armies using them didn't fully understand their impact. And the soldiers paid the price. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of World War I is what it did to the human mind. The constant fear, the endless violence, the loss of friends and comrades. It broke people. Many soldiers returned home physically alive but mentally shattered. At the time, There was no understanding of psychological trauma, no support systems, no recognition of what they had endured. They were expected to move on, but they couldn't, because the war never really left them. It stayed in their memories, their dreams, their silence. And as the years went on, one question quietly remained. Could this have been avoided? The answer is not simple, but there were moments when peace was possible. Moments when leaders could have stepped back, chosen negotiation over conflict. Those moments were missed, sometimes out of pride, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because events were already moving too fast to stop. And so, the war continued. Year after year, consuming everything in its path. But the deeper truth is this. World War I was not just a conflict of nations. It was a result of hidden decisions, secret motives, and a system that pushed the world toward destruction. And many of those truths were never fully revealed. Part 2. As the war dragged on, it became clear that this was not the short conflict leaders had promised. It was something much bigger, something far more destructive. And behind the scenes, forces were at work that most people never knew existed. One of the biggest hidden factors of World War I was economics. War is not just fought with weapons. It is sustained by money. And as the conflict continued, nations began to realize just how expensive it truly was. Governments borrowed massive amounts of money. Industries shifted entirely to support the war effort. Factories produced weapons instead of everyday goods. Entire economies were transformed. But this created another problem. The longer the war lasted, the harder it became to stop. Because ending the war without victory would mean financial collapse, political instability, and loss of power. So instead of seeking peace, many leaders chose to continue fighting, even when they knew the cost. Another untold secret lies in propaganda. Governments didn't just control information. They shaped reality. Posters, newspapers, and speeches were used to influence public opinion. Enemies were portrayed as monsters. Soldiers were portrayed as heroes. War was presented as a noble cause. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic, because maintaining support for the war was essential. Without it, everything could fall apart. But propaganda also had long-term effects. It created hatred. Deep, lasting hatred between nations and people. Hatred that would not disappear when the war ended. And that hatred would shape the future in ways no one fully understood at the time. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the situation grew worse. New offensives were launched again and again, often with little success. Millions of lives were lost, and yet, very little changed. It was a war of exhaustion, a war where victory was not about winning battles, but about surviving longer than the enemy. And then came a turning point, the entry of the United States. Until this moment, the war had been largely European. But when the United States joined, it shifted the balance. Fresh troops, new resources, and renewed energy gave one side a crucial advantage. But even this moment has hidden layers. The decision to enter the war was influenced by multiple factors, including economic interest and attacks on shipping. It was not just about ideals. It was about power, influence, and the future of the global order. As the war neared its end, exhaustion took over. Soldiers were tired. Nations were struggling. Resources were running low. And finally, in 1918, the fighting stopped. But the end of the war did not bring true peace, because the decisions made after the war would shape the world for decades to come. The Treaty of Versailles placed heavy penalties on Germany. Territory was taken. Military power was limited. Massive reparations were demanded. On the surface, it looked like justice, but beneath that surface, it created resentment. Anger. Humiliation. And those emotions did not fade. They grew. This is one of the most important untold truths of World War I. It did not truly end in 1918. It simply set the stage for what would come next, because the conditions created by this war led directly to another, an even more devastating conflict, World War II. And so, when we look back at World War I, we must understand this. It was not just a war of the past. It was a turning point in human history. A moment where decisions made in secret changed the fate of the world. A war that was driven not just by events, but by hidden forces. And even today, its impact can still be felt, because some secrets never truly disappear. They echo through time, waiting to be understood. As the war stretched into its later years, something began to change. Not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of entire nations. The excitement that once filled the streets had disappeared. The pride that once pushed young men to enlist had turned into silence. And in that silence, a dangerous truth started to grow. This war was no longer about victory. It was about survival. Behind the front lines, countries were slowly collapsing under the weight of their own decisions. Food shortages became common. Families struggled to survive. Inflation rose. Basic necessities became luxuries. But the most important thing that was disappearing was hope. Governments knew this. And that is why propaganda became more aggressive than ever before. Posters no longer just encouraged people to support the war. They demanded it. They created fear, guilt, and anger. They told citizens that sacrificing everything was their duty. Men were shamed into fighting. Women were pushed into factories. Children grew up in a world where war felt normal. And yet, even with all this control, cracks began to appear. Soldiers on the front lines started to question everything they had seen. Too much. Too many failed attacks. Too many unnecessary deaths. Too many promises that never came true. In some cases, entire units refused to fight. Mutinies broke out. This is something rarely discussed in classrooms because it challenges the idea of absolute loyalty. But the truth is, many soldiers reached a point where they could no longer continue. They were not cowards. They were exhausted, emotionally, physically, mentally broken. And for many of them, the enemy on the other side of the trench no longer felt like the real enemy because they realized something powerful. The soldiers they were fighting were just like them. Young men, far from home, following orders, trapped in a war they did not choose. There were moments, brief and rare, where this realization became reality. Unofficial truces happened. Soldiers from opposing sides stopped fighting. Even if only for a short time, they shared food. They spoke. They saw each other as human beings, not enemies. But these moments were not allowed to last. Because if soldiers stopped seeing each other as enemies, the war itself would collapse. And that was something those in power could not allow. So control tightened. Discipline became harsher. Punishments became more severe. The system pushed forward, even as it began to break from within. At the same time, another force was rising in the east. Russia. By 1917, the situation there had become critical. Years of war had drained the country. The economy was failing. The people were suffering. And eventually, they reached their limit. Revolution. The Russian Revolution was not just a political event. It was a direct result of the war. The government was overthrown. A new system began to emerge. And one of the first major decisions made by the new leadership was to leave the war. This changed everything. For a moment, it seemed like the balance of power might shift again, but events were already moving too fast. On the other side of the world, another major player had entered the conflict. The United States. Fresh, powerful, and largely untouched by the destruction of the war. It brought something that the exhausted European nations desperately needed. Energy. Resources. Hope. But even this turning point has deeper layers. Because the decision to enter the war was not purely about right and wrong. It was influenced by economic ties, global influence, and the future position of power in the world. War, in many ways, is never just about the battlefield. It is about what comes after. As American forces began to arrive in Europe, the momentum slowly started to shift. Germany, which had held strong for years, now faced a new reality. It was running out of time. Resources were low. Allies were weakening. The pressure was increasing from all sides. And internally, things were falling apart. Just like in other countries, the people were tired. They had suffered for too long. And they began to demand change. By 1918, the situation had reached a breaking point. The fighting could not continue. And so, the war finally came to an end. But here is one of the biggest untold truths. The end of the war did not feel like victory for many. It felt like relief, a desperate, exhausted relief that the suffering had finally stopped. But even in that moment, the seeds of the future were already being planted. The Treaty of Versailles, often described as a peace agreement, it was anything but peaceful. Germany was blamed for the war. It was forced to accept full responsibility. Massive financial reparations were imposed. Its military was severely restricted. Its territory was reduced. On paper, it looked like justice, but in reality, it created something far more dangerous. Resentment. Humiliation. Anger that would not fade. And this is where the story becomes even more important. Because World War I did not truly end with that treaty. It simply changed form. The economic pressure, the political instability, and the emotional scars left behind created the perfect conditions for another conflict. A bigger one. A more destructive one. World War II. This is why understanding the hidden truths of World War I matters. Because it was not just a war of its time. It was the beginning of a chain reaction that shaped the entire 20th century. And even today, its impact can still be seen. In borders. In politics. In the way nations interact with each other. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. Wars are not always started by a single event. They are built slowly, through decisions, through fears, through ambitions. Through mistakes. And sometimes the most dangerous part is not what people know. It is what they don't know. The secrets, the hidden motives, the choices made behind closed doors. Because those are the things that truly shape history. And if we don't understand them, we risk repeating them.